The camera pans across the decaying timbers of a forgotten plantation barn, its shadows twisting like living things. A whisper crawls through the silence. They said she vanished, but the barn remembers. The air is thick with rot, and something sweeter, metallic. A child's laughter echoes faintly from the darkness, followed by a thud that shakes the floorboards. No one speaks her name aloud anymore, but every door in the town closes a little tighter when her story is mentioned. In 1843, on the outskirts of a town buried in moss and sin, a plantation lady made a choice so monstrous it splintered her family's legacy, giving her daughter to 3 slaves as a punishment, a ritual, or perhaps something older, more primordial. The records are sparse, fragmented, yet whispers in churchyards, coded entries in ledger books, and strange scars on the land itself speak volumes. Something was done in the barn that night, something that the wind carries in its hollow sighs. And tonight, we begin the descent into the story no one should know, the marrow-deep terror lurking behind a veil of wealth, tradition, and cruelty. Eleanor Whitcomb was the plantation's sovereign, draped always in silk and shadow. She walked her halls with the authority of an empress and the cruelty of a storm. Her daughter, Marion, had grown corpulent, fragile, a reflection of indulgence and neglect. Eleanor's obsession with control twisted into a doctrine. The body is a vessel of shame and punishment, and Marion's was the most public of all. Townspeople spoke in hushed tones of Eleanor's nightly rituals, the way she would lock her daughter away, speaking in tongues older than the county itself, invoking curses whispered from her mother's mother. Those who worked the fields, the silent witnesses, bore witness to strange exchanges. Eleanor instructing Marion to crawl into corners, whispering names no one dared repeat, commanding the 3 slaves, Thomas, Abigail, and Josiah, to perform tasks that were less labor and more right. The air on the plantation was thick with fear, obedience, and something almost sacred in its horror. There was a cadence to Eleanor's madness, a rhythm that suggested these acts were not only punishment, but communion with a darkness hidden within the land itself. When Marion disappeared into the barn, the air grew heavier, the shadows longer, and the silence outside the house became a chorus of muted dread. The barn had always been forbidden. Its doors were locked from the outside, the hinges rusted, the wood gnawed by time. Locals said it was haunted, not by spirits, but by memory. Every plank seemed soaked in residue of grief, shame, and something primal. When Marion was brought there, the 3 slaves carried her with a mixture of terror and resignation, the night's fog curling around them like a predator. Eleanor watched from the threshold, her eyes reflecting torchlight, her lips murmuring syllables that belonged to no tongue spoken in the county. Inside, the barn was transformed. Hay scattered like a ritual altar, symbols etched into the walls, strange implements lined like instruments of judgment. The air was thick with ammonia and the tang of decay, a smell that would linger in memory for decades. Something about that night defied reason. The slaves later described a feeling as if the barn itself were alive, its beams bending, its shadows breathing, reacting to Eleanor's commands. Marion's body became a vessel, a canvas of power and punishment, as the 3 performed tasks that bordered on the ceremonial. Every scream, every sob, every silence was absorbed by the barn, and the building kept them, like a mirror reflecting the worst of humanity and the darkest of inherited curses. Thomas, Abigail, and Josiah bore the weight of Eleanor's wrath and the plantation's unspoken terror. They were people accustomed to suffering, yet that night tested the bounds of endurance. Eleanor's commands were cryptic. Do not break her, yet break her. They moved in a rhythm dictated by fear and reverence, their eyes constantly flicking to the swinging shadows, the creaking rafters, the oppressive air that seemed almost sentient. Each action was a transgression against instinct, morality, and human decency. The barn's walls seemed to pulse with Marion's presence, her body a medium through which Eleanor sought control over life itself. The 3 slaves whispered amongst themselves, sharing fragmented prayers, but the air swallowed every word. When the rituals ended, the barn was silent, save for the occasional drip of water from a splintered roof. Eleanor left, her face untouched by the acts she orchestrated, while the 3 were left with an ineffable burden, a secret so potent, so malignant, it seemed to warp their memory of reality itself. Every step they took away from the barn was haunted by what they carried. Not the weight of the body alone, but the weight of a darkness older than the plantation, older than the land itself. Outside the plantation, the town breathed a different fear. Life went on, but the air carried a tension no one could name. Children whispered of the Whitcomb barn, daring each other to approach its gates, while adults crossed the street to avoid its shadow. Every church pew, every ledger book, every courthouse file held only fragments. A name scratched, a ledger entry half erased, a sermon hinting at sin without specifying. The townspeople had long understood that some truths were too dangerous to voice, that some transgressions demanded silence. Eleanor Whitcomb's name was whispered only in hushed tones, and even then, accompanied by a shiver. The plantation was both a monument and a warning, its walls holding memory like a tightly wound spring. At night, the wind carried strange sounds, groans, laughter, the scrape of feet across boards. Some said the barn itself walked in dreams, a phantom of guilt and power, reminding all who slept nearby that the line between cruelty and devotion had been crossed, and that nothing human could undo it. Those who tried to pry, to question, or to investigate vanished from the margins of records, leaving only hints, a pattern of erasure as precise as it was unnerving. Marion Whitcomb's body became both symbol and cipher. Her once plump frame, the object of Eleanor's obsessive discipline, was now a canvas for ritual and punishment. The barn walls absorbed every scream, every tear, every command whispered by her mother. When historians later pieced together fragments of testimony, they spoke in euphemisms. Her body was transformed. She did not emerge the same. The barn became her crucible. Yet the truth, locked in the marrow of the land, defied documentation. Contemporary observers noted that no cadaver could match the descriptions given decades later. Limbs contorted in ways that suggested both agony and transcendence, the skin bearing impressions of implements long gone, a residue of something almost supernatural. Some claimed the barn had drained Marion's essence, leaving her alive only in shadow and memory. Others spoke of her laughter echoing years later through empty hallways of the plantation, a sound simultaneously innocent and monstrously knowing. Every artifact, every object tied to Marion, a ribbon, a journal, a chair scorched with some unknown ritual, carried a charge, a silent testament to what had occurred behind locked doors. Eleanor Whitcomb's philosophy of control was brutal, yet meticulously codified. To her, the body was a vessel of obedience, the mind, a theater of terror, the soul, a ledger for recompense. Her treatment of Marion was an extreme expression of this doctrine, her methods at once maternal and tyrannical, ritualistic and sadistic. She believed that suffering could purify, and that the plantation itself was a living entity demanding tribute. Townspeople spoke of her as a zealot, though the word zealot failed to capture the depth of her conviction. She operated as though in communion with ancestral spirits, invoking powers older than Christianity, older than the county itself, drawing Marion into a world of shadowed rites. Those who dared question Eleanor found themselves subtly, irreversibly corrupted, bound by fear, superstition, and the unspoken understanding that to disobey was to invite annihilation. Her doctrine was a labyrinth, and Marion's body became its center, a nexus where cruelty, ritual, and a grotesque sense of devotion collided. Even the three slaves, bound by obligation and terror, found themselves unwittingly participating in a system that seemed designed to perpetuate itself, to echo through time, never fully explained, never fully documented. Thomas, Abigail, and Josiah survived the night, but their testimonies were fragmented, fractured by trauma and fear. They spoke of shadows that moved independently, of Marion's laughter turning into shrieks that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. They remembered Eleanor chanting in languages unknown, words that burned in memory, words that seemed to mark the barn itself with some terrible covenant. Each retelling felt like trespassing into forbidden knowledge, their voices trembling with the understanding that what they had witnessed was not only cruel but sacramental, a convergence of human sin and something ancient. Town elders dismissed their accounts as superstition, the product of imagination or guilt. But each detail they offered corresponded eerily with later discoveries. Scorched hay, symbols etched in splintered wood, depressions in the floor where Marion's body had been pressed. Scholars would later speculate on the psychological effects, trauma-induced hallucination, mass hysteria. Yet the evidence persisted, stubborn, tangible, horrifying. The barn, the plantation, and Marion herself became a triad of memory, a triangle of terror that no documentation could ever fully capture. And in their dreams, the three carried the echoes of that night, forever bound to a horror that the world refused to name. Even the church, a place meant for sanctuary, bore the weight of Eleanor's darkness. The local minister, Reverend Hargrove, kept a careful distance from the Whitcomb estate, though he attended every social gathering with measured civility. His sermons hinted at sin, punishment, and redemption, but never the specifics of the plantation's horrors. Parishioners murmured about strange offerings left at the churchyard, bundles of hay, feathers, remnants of cloth, and sometimes bones that seemed too small to be accidental. Whispers suggested that Eleanor attended service not to seek salvation but to assert dominion, her presence a reminder of power unchecked. The pews held guilt as palpable as the dust. Children shivered at the mention of Marion's name. Adults avoided eye contact, and even the choir faltered during hymns, as if the barn's echo had seeped into their souls. Some claimed they could hear Marion's voice intertwined with the organ, singing notes that twisted into sobs. The church became a silent witness, its stained glass capturing distorted shadows that seemed to mirror the nightmare unfolding on the estate, confirming that the darkness was not confined to wood and soil. It had entered the hearts of all who dared look away. Beyond the plantation, rumors circulated of Marion's connection to a nearby orphanage, a place where Eleanor's influence quietly extended. Children were observed being disciplined in ways that echoed Marion's punishment. Isolation, ritualized correction, the subtle infusion of fear as a tool of control. The orphanage's director, a stern woman named Mrs. Calhoun, seemed complicit, enforcing rules with mechanical precision, citing morality, but the staff whispered of strange nights when Marion's ghostly laughter was heard, and shadows twisted unnaturally in the halls. The children remembered a lady in silk, walking silently among them, her eyes cold, her presence leaving a chill that never faded. The orphanage became an echo chamber for the plantation's sins, a vector of trauma that ensured Eleanor's doctrine lived beyond her estate, leaving scars on the bodies and minds of the innocent. Scholars later speculated that this extended influence created a network of fear, a cultural contagion that permeated the town, binding generations to unspoken horrors and unexamined guilt. As decades passed, the town itself seemed to attempt an erasure. Maps were redrawn, buildings burned or abandoned, and families moved or vanished from the records. Oral histories became distorted, fragmented, almost mythic, yet persistent traces of Eleanor's influence endured. A child who heard the story in the 1870s would whisper it to the next generation, but details shifted like smoke. The daughter vanished. The barn consumed her. 3 servants carried her spirit into the ground. Each version retained the emotional core, terror, shame, suppression, but obscured the mechanics of the act, turning human cruelty into legend. It was as if the town instinctively knew that some truths were too malignant, too corrupting, to survive the light of memory. Historians would later find ledger entries, letters, and diary fragments, cryptic, incomplete, almost deliberately obscured. Yet the essence remained. Marion's disappearance was not accidental, and the barn held secrets that no human comprehension could fully encompass. Decades after Marion's disappearance, the barn remained, decaying yet impossibly intact, a shrine to memory and horror. Scholars, thrill-seekers, and historians who dared enter documented strange symbols etched into the wooden beams, spirals, crosses inverted, markings reminiscent of lost languages. Some believe these were Eleanor's work, a coded ritual meant to bind the estate, her family, and the town itself to the act she had orchestrated. Others suspected the symbols were not of human origin. The grain of the wood itself seemed to twist unnaturally, embedding the marks as if the building itself had learned the language of punishment. The floorboards retained impressions, depressions too precise to be random, aligned in a way suggesting ritual geometry. Visitors reported dizziness, nausea, sudden crying, and whispers that came from no one. The barn was no longer simply a building. It had become a vessel, a psychic repository of trauma, where human cruelty intersected with something ancient, something alive. Every sound, shadow, and smell served as evidence that the past was never past, that Marion's ordeal had imprinted itself onto the very marrow of the estate, waiting for someone to bear witness. Beneath the main house, rumors of hidden chambers persisted. Secret staircases, trapdoors, and bricked-up rooms suggested Eleanor's obsession with secrecy extended beyond the barn. Researchers who uncovered the blueprints noted rooms that had no recorded function, small, windowless spaces that smelled of earth, decay, and iron. Some speculated these were observation points for Eleanor to watch her daughter and the 3 slaves, ensuring her rituals were performed to exacting standards. Others suggested a darker purpose, a space where Eleanor conducted private rites, speaking to forces unknown, mapping Marion's body as one would chart constellations, tracing sin and obedience with equal precision. The chambers were so hidden that even descendants of the estate had to stumble upon them accidentally, discovering remnants of garments, scorched herbs, and cryptic journals filled with symbols that resisted translation. Each artifact seemed imbued with unease, as if the act of observing the past was itself a perilous transgression. Fragments of Marion's own writing survived, barely legible, preserved in the humidity of the estate. Her journal entries are disjointed, a mix of fear, despair, and moments of eerie clarity. She wrote of the barn's air breathing around her, of shadows that kissed and clawed her skin, and of the 3 slaves moving in a rhythm that was both protection and entrapment. One passage reads, "Mother does not love me. She loves the silence, the shape of my fear, the way I bend without breaking. And yet, I see something in her eyes, something that wants me to remember, to hold it within me forever." Scholars have debated whether Marion's words are literal or hallucinatory, a psychological record of trauma or a conduit for something older, something unnatural that seeped into her mind. Her writing, like the barn itself, is incomplete, leaving the reader suspended between terror, fascination, and disbelief. The surviving slaves, Thomas, Abigail, and Josiah, were forever changed. Their lives became a series of quiet exiles within the same town that once bound them to Eleanor. Each claimed to have seen Marion after the night in ways that defied logic, glimpses in mirrors, reflections in water, or in shadows that did not belong to the living. Their testimony was met with skepticism, but townsfolk who knew the 3 swore the stories were true. Each carried a mark, an unexplained twitch, a shiver at certain times of day, the occasional cry in their sleep. The community, steeped in fear and superstition, eventually distanced itself from them, recognizing that proximity to the estate's darkness left an indelible imprint. Over decades, these 3 became the living archive of the plantation's secrets, their memories precise, fragmented, and tinged with a terror that no one could fully articulate. Memory itself became a kind of curse. Children born in the town decades later described dreams of the barn, of Marion, of shadows that moved with intent. Oral histories hinted at recurring motifs, laughter that turns to screaming, the smell of hay mingled with copper, whispers from nowhere. Historians who attempted to catalog these accounts noted a pattern. Collective trauma persisted even when records were incomplete, even when direct witnesses had long passed. The estate, the barn, and the Whitcomb legacy seemed to infect the very landscape, imprinting stories into the psyche of those nearby. Visitors to the plantation today report unease, vertigo, and a sensation of being watched. Some claim that the barn seems to shift in size, that shadows move counter to natural light, that Marion herself still lingers, neither fully present nor entirely gone. The past, in this place, does not remain buried. It waits, it watches, and it remembers. In the 1920s, descendants of the Whitcomb family attempted to restore the plantation. The barn, long closed to the world, was finally opened. Those who entered spoke of an oppressive weight, as though the building itself exhaled despair. The air was thick, humid, and metallic. The floorboards creaked underfoot as if groaning in remembrance. Scholars and descendants alike reported sudden dizziness, chills, and visions of Marion, her face twisted in sorrow and accusation, her body both corporeal and spectral. Some felt hands brush theirs, heard whispers of syllables that made no sense, or glimpsed shadows detaching from the walls. The barn was not merely a structure. It had become a vessel of memory, a living archive of Eleanor's cruelty. Each artifact left behind, a frayed ribbon, scorched hay, a rusted tool, seemed to hum with energy, retaining the trauma, the pain, and the unspeakable acts performed within. To leave was not merely a relief. It was an act of survival, as if the barn tested one's resolve to witness its secrets. Eleanor's bloodline, generations later, carried a subtle, unspoken curse. Family gatherings were quiet, tense, punctuated by inexplicable illnesses and sudden tragedies. Dreams of barns, shadows, and Marion's face haunted those born decades after the events. Some descendants attempted to document family history, only to encounter erased records, missing diaries, and ledger entries that seemed deliberately obliterated. Psychologists later speculated on inherited trauma. Folklorists whispered of ancestral guilt manifesting in psychic echoes. Every mention of Marion caused unease. Every inquiry into the plantation invited resistance, and the deeper one delved, the more the past clawed back, insisting that Eleanor's doctrine, Marion's ordeal, and the three slaves' silent testimony remain inseparable, a trinity of terror embedded into the family and the land itself. Over the years, Marion became both legend and warning. Stories blurred, mixing fact, fear, and imagination. Some claim she had never truly died, that the barn had absorbed her essence, transforming her into a spectral guardian, an avenger, or a witness. Others suggested Eleanor's actions were ritualistic attempts to harness forces older than memory, that the estate itself was alive, conscious, and forever corrupted. Historical documents provide fragments, newspaper clippings, letters, journals, and ledger entries that hint at cruelty, secrecy, and the presence of forces beyond comprehension. In the quietest moments, townspeople swear that the barn exhales a subtle sigh of memory, mourning, and menace. Marion's body, Eleanor's obsession, and the three slaves' silent endurance converge in a story that no historian can fully explain, yet whose echoes remain unmistakably alive. The plantation is a crucible, and the past refuses to be silenced. Today, the Whitcomb Plantation stands in ruins, the barn rotting yet somehow unyielding. The wind carries whispers of Marion, laughter turned to sobs, and shadows that stretch beyond reason. Archaeologists and urban explorers report sensations of being watched, objects shifting inexplicably, and an overwhelming sense of sorrow and anger that seems to emanate from the soil itself. The story of Eleanor, Marion, and the three slaves is not simply history. It is a warning, a testament to the ways cruelty, secrecy, and obsession can warp generations, haunt landscapes, and create a darkness that refuses to die. Visitors leave with a lingering sense that they are not alone, that the barn has remembered them, and that Marion's ordeal continues to unfold, layer by layer, in the marrow of the land. The plantation is not a relic. It is a living testament to hidden corruption, institutional control, and ancient trauma. And in the end, the question remains, what becomes of the body when the barn claims it? Some answers are too terrible, too luminous, and too infinite to ever fully emerge.